Hello, I'm Monica Sieber and I head up Anfasa's copyright team. Anfasa is an organisation that has quite a lot of experience in copyright. We're an organisation that our members, who are authors, can come to when they have a problem such as a publishing contract that they've signed, or as often happens, unfortunately, when something's gone wrong with the relationship between them as author and the publisher.
My name is Louis Geiger. I'm a publisher. I've been working in the South African publishing industry in different sectors for the last 15 years. And I'm also a member of the Legal Affairs Committee. So I have an active interest in copyright and in all legal matters pertaining to publishing.
So Louis and I have been working together on something called Apact, the Anfasa-PASA Agreement on Contract Terms. A few years ago, Anfasa, the Authors Association, and PASA, the Publishers Association, got together and negotiated an agreement on the standard terms which should always appear in a publishing contract. It's a product of several years of discussions between authors and publishers, and it encapsulates what really should exist in a good publishing contract. It's a guideline, an explanatory guideline. It's not mandatory, but it's highly recommended by the Publishers Association. It's non-prescriptive, it's aimed at fostering and upholding what we call a constructive and a cooperative relationship between authors and publishers, and especially one in which they have equal terms, that the publisher doesn't dominate the author, nor the author the publisher. The Apact agreement records the standard clauses of the publishing agreement, and it defines them, which is very important. These are guidelines to understand and interpret key contractual terms to be agreed on, such as royalty percentages. Established publishers can use Apact to assess their standard contracts that they've been using in terms of these guidelines. Less experienced publishers will find Apact a very useful standard on which to base the contracts that they're drafting. And authors, especially who are usually less familiar with publishing contracts than publishers are, they can compare the contracts presented to them by a publisher with the guidelines to determine possible scope for negotiation. Apact says that the term publishing agreement refers to a legally binding contract between a publisher and an author. It must spell out the terms of the transaction clearly and in sufficient detail in order for the parties to later rely on the contract to achieve their original intentions. It's customary for the publisher to take the lead by presenting a draft contract to the author. As I said, the publisher is usually the party more familiar with publishing contracts than the author, but both parties should fully understand all the terms and conditions in the contract. Authors who don't understand a contractual term or provision should seek clarification from the publisher, and the publisher should be prepared to provide the required explanation. One important aspect of Apact is the way that it explains how the rights granted in the contract, that is, the rights to publish the work, revert to the author at the termination of the contract. When a contract comes to an end, everything that the author grants to the publisher in terms of the contract reverts to the author. We call this the reversion of rights. The contract also covers subsidiary rights. It covers the author's and publisher's respective roles in the publishing process. It covers, as I said, the payment of royalties. It covers certain warranties and indemnities in which the author warrants that he or she is the author and the copyright owner and hasn't copied the work of somebody else, among other things that are warranted. It covers how third-party copyright material will be used, competing works, sales and remainders, and so on. It talks about royalties, which are normally a percentage of the author's net receipts. Net receipts are the money the publisher actually receives from sales of the book. Sometimes, but less often nowadays, the royalty is a percentage of the retail selling price of the book. Apact doesn't recommend any particular percentage. This is the subject of negotiation between the author and the publisher. Apact only says that the contract must contain a clause specifying the percentage and how payment will be made. Apact says that when the book is out of print or no longer selling, the contract may come to an end. We say that it terminates, or sometimes we say that it determines. And all rights granted by the author to the publisher revert to the author. Apact insists that every publishing contract must contain a clause indicating how the contract will terminate and specifying how rights will revert. When it was first drafted, Apact was endorsed by the National Library of South Africa, and it was printed as a booklet. Both Anfasa and PASA promoted it to their memberships, and several workshops have been held to get feedback from authors and publishers. An updated second edition was issued in 2015 after further negotiations between teams from the two organizations. We're working on a further revision of the booklet, not the agreement itself, but the booklet. We're working on that now. We haven't got it ready yet, but I'm sure that some of you watching this film would like to have a copy. And if you would, please send your name and contact details to Anfasa, and we will email it to you as soon as it's ready. We're not here to give you the lecture on copyright, Copyright 101 as we call it. And we're not here to reveal all the secrets of the copyright universe. But we're going to talk about some of the questions we get and the way that we answered those questions. Louis, I asked you to send me some really basic questions that authors and publishers ask about copyright. Let's deal with those first.
Thank you. Thanks, Monica. It's lovely to be with you. And thanks for this opportunity to engage about the exciting world of copyright. So I think we'll start with one of the very basic standard questions. How long does copyright last?
Copyright lasts for 50 years after the end of the year in which the author dies. That seems to be a very simple answer, but actually it's not so simple. And in fact, it's a trick question, because what happens if the work hasn't been published within the author's lifetime? Copyright, if so, copyright will be perpetual. In other words, it lasts forever. So what should I do if, let's think of something. Supposing I found an old suitcase in an attic somewhere, and when I opened it, I found an ancient manuscript. And when I looked at it even more closely, I saw that it was written in the unmistakable hand of William Shakespeare. Is it in copyright? Can I publish it?
The main idea there is that if it hasn't been published yet, then it still is in copyright.
Well, who would I ask for permission to copy? Who owns the copyright? Since Shakespeare's been dead for these few hundred years, we're just giving you a rather unlikely example of some of the problems that arise in copyright. But basically, copyright lasts for 50 years from the end of the year in which the author dies. There's always a but. There are two or more, but let's stick to the two that I'm talking about, copyrights in every book. One is the copyright in the content, and that content lasts for 50 years after the end of the year in which the author dies. There's another copyright, and that's in what we call the published edition, the layout on the page, the way that the content is assembled. It's called the published edition, and that belongs to the publisher. How long does that last, Louis?
Also 50 years, but also in that sense, it's not as if you can take a Dover edition Charles Dickens book and just republish it. I mean, there would be an impediment there. That would be the published edition, and you won't be allowed to make a copy and sell that.
Yeah, once the book is no longer in copyright, the content of it falls into the public domain, and it can be freely copied by anyone and used in any other way. Which leads us onto another one of Louis' questions, a question that publishers sometimes ask, and that is, can I legally adapt or copy parts from a book that's out of print without permission? Well, before I hand over to Louis, I want to say that I always say out of print doesn't mean out of copyright.
Exactly. But it's quite a rigmarole. It's quite a wild goose chase sometimes to find the copyright owner, because publishers change hands, lists of publishers also change hands. There could be different elements, for instance, photographs or illustrations that copyright also has to be sought for. You have to be a literary sleuth sometimes to be able to track it down, the copyright holder, but at least you must be able to show that you've tried, that you've given it your best. That would safeguard you against any claims, and if there's another edition, it can be corrected. But there is a duty of care on you to actually make the effort of finding the copyright holder and asking permission.
That's right, Louis. Even if by law you can make a copy, it's only courteous and reasonable to ask for permission. Let's move on to another question that seems simple, but it's got far-reaching implications for authors, and that is the question of moral rights. What are moral rights, Louis?
Well, there are basically two rights that aren't in the publishing contract, but always hold sway. The right of integrity, so no one is allowed to butcher your work, and also the right of attribution. So you must be recognized as the author of a work if you are the author. It's powerful rights. You can't waive them. Well, you can waive them only if you expressly do so. They can't be taken away from you. And they are implied part of the publishing contract, even if they aren't articulated as such.
Do you mean to say that you can't change anything in a person's work without infringing their moral rights?
Well, there would be a reputational aspect to that. If it harms the reputation of the author, then you won't be allowed to do that. So it's quite it's subjective and objective in a way. It's the reputation of the author in the broader world, in the broader academic community, or.
Yes, I can see that now. So, that, for instance, if you're a publisher and the author is, say, a medical person, and they're writing about medical procedures, you're not free to change it as you wish, because if you change it to something that was incorrect, you'd be damaging the author's reputation,
Yes.
and you'd then be infringing their moral rights. Is infringing an author's moral rights the same thing as infringing their copyright?
No, that's also an interesting part of the discussion. With copyright, you can actually assign your copyright, so you can actually hand it over to or contractually
Sign it away.
But with your moral rights, you can't sign it away. Well, you can sort of expressly waive it.
Do you mean to say that you can? It's something like an author could say to a publisher, I don't mind if you don't identify me as an author. My name doesn't have to be on the front cover of the book. It's possible to do that, but you still keep those moral rights.
Yes, but if you're a ghostwriter, for instance, then you won't be acknowledged
I understand
as an
now.
author.
Do you think that publishers scrupulously observe authors' moral rights?
I would hope they do. I think most do. There is sometimes a bit of a sense that if you have the copyright, that you've got a kind of freedom to do with the text what you want. But my sense is that publishers are careful and respectful of the moral rights of the author. But I've also seen instances where books were butchered or manuscripts were butchered to comply with market needs, or what's perceived as being the market needs.
What did the authors do about that?
Well, took recourse, spoke to the publishing house. the publications have stopped at least. That was effectively done. But I think by and large most publishing houses are aware and sensitive to moral rights. But it's a very strong basis, especially for the fact that it isn't part of the publishing contract expressly.
Louis, a few moments ago you mentioned assigning copyright. Would you like to say a few more words about that?
Well, when you write a text or any literary work, literary in the broader sense of the word, you are the copyright owner, but you can decide then to sign it, to hand over the copyright to a publishing house, for instance. And with copyright, we're thinking very much of a bundle of rights. So it would be the right to translate it or to adapt it or reproduce it, all those rights sort of bundled together. So if you assign your copyright to a publishing house, that means that the publishing house would have the rights to do all those things. So as an author, you always need to decide if that's the best option for your work, for what you want to achieve with your work.
And FASA advises its members not to assign their copyrights to their publishers if it's at all possible. In fact, we say never assign your copyright to a publisher. There was a time a few years ago when publishers in South Africa routinely expected their authors to assign copyright to them, but that's much less so nowadays.
Yes, I understand, Monica, but with works with multiple authors and complex work where there's quite a strong hand of commissioning, it makes sense sometimes to assign the copyright. I mean, if you have to manage a larger publication and succession, for instance, of authors, then it's to the benefit of the project to have the copyright. But I understand why the advice would be to grant licensing for certain rights than to a publishing house.
I hear what you're saying, Louis. Authors have asked FASA if there's any difference for them between assigning their copyrights to a publisher and granting the publisher the exclusive license to publish their works. And what we tell them is that in a very basic way, there is no difference. The publisher can still, depending on what you grant them in the license, the publisher can still do everything necessary to publish your book and then to distribute it and sell it afterwards. I think the example you gave us is a very good one, Louis, in that when it comes to a textbook, when there's multiple authors involved in the writing of the book, it's very difficult for the publisher to deal with multiple copyrights. But that's the only reason I can think of that justifies expecting the author to assign copyright.
The whole bundle with licensing, you can still grant the publisher the right to handle your subsidiary rights or rights like film rights.
Well, that's another thing we advise authors on. They need guidance on what the subsidiary rights are and which ones they should grant to the publishers and which they should keep to themselves. Now, subsidiary rights is quite a involved topic, but the basic principle that we try to convey to the authors who consult us is that a contract between a publisher and an author is a negotiable instrument, and it should be approached from a common sense perspective, and both parties to the contract have a right to negotiate terms which they seem unfavorable to themselves, and that an author is only justified in keeping certain of the subsidiary rights if there's a likelihood that they're going to be able to use them. And at the same time, a publisher is only justified in insisting that those rights are handed over if it is going to use them. Mm-hmm. I'll quickly give you an example. Film rights is one of the subsidiary rights. And an author might think, well, I must hang on to this and not let the publisher have the film rights to my book because, maybe one day somebody will approach me and want to make a movie out of my book. But does the author really have any opportunity? Does the author know anybody in the film industry who's likely to make a request for film rights? On the other hand, maybe the publisher does have contacts in the film industry, in which case the publisher would be justified in insisting on having film rights.
I think it's a very good example. It's good to mention that as well. But I think there's definitely a duty of care also on the publisher, who is a professional, to also to instruct or to help authors make sense of the publishing contract, to actually discuss moral rights, to discuss the different kinds of rights, to actually also point out the difference between copyright and licensing rights.
You are absolutely right. And that's why it's so important for both publishers and authors to understand what a publishing contract is and to see themselves as equal partners to a publishing contract. But let's move on to that most frequently asked question by authors rather than publishers. And that is, how does copyright vest in my book? Often incorrectly phrased as, how can I copyright my book? Louis, would you like to say something about that?
I'll give it a try, and then I'll be glad if you augment my answer. The first point to remember is that copyright vests automatically. You don't have to register copyright in South Africa. It's not like a patent. So when you produce a work by the sweat of your brow, then you'd have copyright in that work, as long as it's original. Originality is the main criterion when it comes to copyright. So it doesn't matter whether it's disseminated or published on the internet or in print. Copyright doesn't vest in ideas. It has to be expressed. It has to be
I've heard that expression, yes. There's no copyright in ideas.
It has to be in a tangible format or a recognizable format. But I'm sure you've got an interesting line also on this question and on the protection of copyright.
Oh, yes. I was giving a workshop in Cape Town, it was, at the Centre for the Book. And my audience was a group of authors. I think some of them were quite elderly, and they asked me a lot of questions about how can I protect my book. And I told them these things. They asked the question about posting it to yourself, and I explained that maybe it wasn't entirely necessary. And they kept asking questions, so many that in the end I lost my temper. And I said, I'll tell you how you can protect your book. You can put it in an envelope, put it in a drawer, lock the drawer, take the key, put it in a bank vault, and nobody will ever see your work. Nobody will be able to copy it. It'll be completely safe from all prying eyes forever.
And save it from the readers probably too. I don't know if you've done the reader also a service.
Yes. I didn't say that. I think I might have been lynched if I had said it. But they all sat there looking at me with very big eyes, and of course I was quite embarrassed by that. But all you need to do is to put that copyright symbol, the C, within a circle, and your name and the year in which you did it.
One encounters very strange things in the copyright realm. Recently, I was sent a manuscript for publication that dealt with ailments and natural remedies, and it consisted of descriptions of ailments, then with little bulleted lists of what remedies could possibly work. And on closer inspection, it turned out that the ailments were basically lifted from medical websites. So I did raise this with the author, and he was completely stunned. And I think his honest opinion was that it wasn't plagiarism, it wasn't a copyright infringement. And I think that also shows the kind of misconceptions, along with the ladies who don't want their work in the public realm in any way. I think it shows what kind of work still has to be done. And from his side, he didn't realize that material published on the internet could be copyright protected. He thought it's sufficient to just have a bibliography in which you sort of thank the internet generally And that would be a sufficient way of
Louis,
quoting and
Louis, I
sourcing.
can't wait to interrupt you because this is so important. People think that everything on the internet is free because it's there on the screen. You can do whatever you want with it. You can freely copy it. Everything on the internet is copyright protected. In other words, it's content that belongs to somebody, and you can't just take it.
But also that aspect that interests me is that he also held that there's no, since it was medical texts, it just sort of floats around. There's no real authorship that clings to it, no real copyright that should be involved at all. So there's also a weird sort of disconnect there between the expression of facts and what's sort of perceived as being objective facts.
It's actually a very tricky and difficult subject, that what is a fact. Is a list, for instance, a copyright protected thing? Can you just take somebody's list and reproduce it somewhere? No, you can't actually. Even if a list put together by somebody, if the items on that list are individually simple facts which are not protected, the way in which the list has been organized and put together is copyright protected. You can't just take somebody's list and make it your own and reproduce it. You can take it, you can read it, you can write it down, but you can't reproduce it. If we're talking about strange queries that we've received from authors and publishers, I've got a really good one here. This one came from an editor at a publishing house, and she wrote, "We're preparing a learner's book on the various world religions with several quotes from translations of original sacred texts. The Bible's okay," this is what she wrote, "the Bible's okay because the foundation gives you specific usage parameters to work with. The Baha'i quotes have all been granted, but our largest contributor is the Quran, and I can't get any information about copyright. What is your understanding regarding copyright of sacred texts?"
And you had an understanding, you had an answer.
Well, what would your answer be to the question, who has copyrighted the Word of God?